Trump, and maybe the story's apocryphal, is after Al Smith was crushed in that election, and they asked him what his reaction was, and he said, "I sent a telegram to the Pope, just one word, unpack." It was a joke. It was a joke that had a lot of sting to it because, you know, John Kennedy had to go through that very same thing. And the fact that he was indeed, you know, elected president in 1960 was more than a passing thing here in Bellarmine. It was a very significant thing. Now, the painful part of that is that in the sophomore oratorical contest, I gave a speech on the importance of John Kennedy being elected president. And I actually could recite most of it here today, and I think you'd probably agree with me. Tom, this is a great speech. I didn't even place in the contest. Didn't even place, and I've been looking, and Jerry won't help me on this, to find out who the judges were in that contest. I kind of figured maybe that guy Tom Horton was involved. I don't know. And then to add pain to it, my brother looked at the speech one day, he said, "This isn't too bad." He took it, he rewrote it. He was a freshman at Santa Clara. He went over and gave it in the prestigious OWL oratorical contest. Man, this guy doesn't have a chance, I'm thinking. He won first place. That's all the absolute truth, as is most things you're going to hear from me tonight. Let's get back to how the Valley is changing. You know, one of the most traumatic and interesting things that I think have happened, both at the same time, is what I call the Katrina years in San Jose. You know, we hit the 60s, and change was endemic. You know, you had the tremendous centrifugal forces pushing out. You had the highway system. You had housing. You had all the things that were happening in this valley. You know, a lot of Bellarmine people were involved in a very positive way in that. The homes that were built by Steve Schott and the Valley family became what one observer said, the greatest piece of democratic art was the suburban home. And it gave people a tremendous lifestyle here. And we were growing, you know, every decade larger and larger. We were growing, you know, 450,000 people in the 70s and onward to where we are now. But what happened, you always have to remember there's when you turn one little knob here, other knobs move in the other direction. I call it the Katrina years, where downtown San Jose, which provided the tax base for this entire valley, downtown San Jose from the original Pueblo until basically in the early 1960s was the major tax base for this entire valley and certainly for the city of San Jose. So in that very brief period of time, that Katrina era, 1958 to probably about 1968 or so, downtown disappeared as a tax base. So many of you will remember every movie theater was down there. You know, the old Fox, the UA, the studio. Every car dealership was down there. Robert M. Benson's from right behind us, the building over there at Benson Center in Santa Clara. The Normandins, the Coyles. All of that tax base was there. And every major department store. Parts and Hales and things. Now think about it. If you had today, in a 5 or 6 or 8 year period of time, everything at Valley Fair, everything at Santana Row, all the car dealerships of Capitol Expressway and Stevens Creek Boulevard, along with most of the commercial that you see in those areas, disappear in 6 years. It would be a body blow that few could sustain. And the fact that downtown San Jose is still alive and viable now is much more an indication of strength and resilience than anything else. So that happened really in the flickering of an eye, and you know, when you live through it, you kind of, you know, it goes by kind of quickly, and you see one thing close and another thing's close. But then when you step back and see the totality of it, it was one of the most massive collapses of the tax base. And the political structure was just unable to deal with it. Unable to deal, they didn't understand, you know, growth. We were growing, as I say, exponentially, larger and larger and larger, with the idea that growth has all positives to it. And growth is kind of like somebody once said about a book, actually it was Oscar Wilde, just to show you I paid attention a little bit in some of those classes. So there aren't good books, there aren't moral or immoral books, or they're well written or poorly written. And that's the way I've always felt about growth in this valley. It can be a wonderful thing or it can be a destructive thing. If it's not channeled properly, it'll be destructive. If it's channeled properly, if you build your tax base, if you allow schools and libraries, the other things that have to come with a growing community, if you allow all those to happen and to proper way, it can and should be very, very prosperous. So Katrina time was something very important in San Jose. You also have in that period of time the advent of something that started with really with a fellow by the name of Professor Terman up at Stanford. He gave two guys named Dave and Bill an opportunity. They went into a garage. I'm sure a few other things happened in there, but the company that evolved from that was really the gold standard, not only for how you run a company, at least in their era it was, but how you participate in the community. In the beginning of Silicon Valley, as it wound its way down to Palo Alto and ended up in San Jose, we kind of, were underneath the window and we're smart enough to catch it because it could have went by us. It was really one of the great stories of the 20th century or any other century. And people at Bellarmine, of course, played a very significant part in that at just about all levels, Tradition is something that people think that San Jose maybe doesn't have quite the ring to it. I've always been amazed here when usually it's some pundit from San Francisco that'll talk about the inferiority complex that people in San Jose have. It amazed me before I was mayor, it amazed me the 8 years I was mayor, and it amazes me now. The idea that people in San Jose and this valley, with the traditions we all have, could feel inferior to just about anyone. I don't mean in a very puffing out your chest way, but in a way that what has been accomplished here in this valley by individuals who are the children and grandchildren of people who came through Ellis Island or across the South China Sea with little or nothing, the way they have molded a great civilization, a tax base that's the envy of the world, and an economic engine that's literally has changed the way we do everything, the way we do our business, the way recreation, the way we interrelate personal networking systems. Everything really happened in this valley right here. So it always has astonished me as reading the papers and listening to the news and television often do, that you would feel in any way that San Jose or this valley is inferior to anyone. And you can kind of see the reverberations of that when they headline a Silicon Valley story with San Francisco. San Francisco is a great city. It's probably its best years really are behind it. It was a great city. I speak now as a historian. I taught both at Santa Clara and Stanford. I couldn't get the job at Santa Clara for a while, so I took the Stanford one. I could work my way up to Santa Clara, and it kind of worked that way. But really, you look at great cities, and I don't use that word often with San Jose. Great things have happened here, but San Francisco was a city that was the financial, commercial, and cultural capital of the Western United States, really in the 1880s. When San Jose was a small agricultural community with a very small downtown. So the changes that have happened as San Jose moved into the great economic engine it is now are really pretty impressive, and really good historians, even better than me, like Kevin Starr, who writes about this, really understand how clearly San Jose has been that economic engine that has changed this valley in very significant ways, changed the state, changed the country, and indeed has changed the world in each and every way we interrelate. Coming back to Bellarmine, which I always like to come back to, both physically and in my thinking, you wonder about the tradition here. Now, the fourth John, I said my father, John and my father graduated in 1926. The fourth John McHenry started Bellarmine here this year, a freshman. And it's something that in many other communities, I think, you have certain pieces of that, but the idea that we're part of a Bellarmine family like that is really pretty extraordinary. It's not what you learn here in a very clear way that I think is most important. I think what's really important is what you absorb that isn't quite as apparent at the time. The different people, when you come in here and see all the pictures on the wall, or when you walk around the campus, I mean, people like John Hanna and Jim Rooney and Joe Costa, they were, legendary characters. They were people who were admirable on just about every level. They were people who you looked as role models. They were people who you learned from. And it wasn't like we actually can remember the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. How many parts Gaul is divided into. 3. count to 3.